Then you have other people, the 9/11 widows. These are the women who lost their children, their husband, who lost people in these attacks on the terrorists on 9/11. And they are very active. They pushed for a 9/11 investigation. It's only actually thanks to the 9/11 widows and that they stood up and said, we want to have more clarity on what happened, that we had a 9/11 commission who investigated the attacks. The 9/11 commission was presided by Thomas Keane and Lee Hamilton. That's Thomas Keane and that's Lee Hamilton. And they presented their 9/11 commission report in 2004 in the summer. So for historians, that was the most important book, because that was the official story. But the important thing to notice is that these two gentlemen were appointed by Bush, okay? So it was not an independent investigation. It was not Congress that investigated 9/11. It was selected people, former governors, former members of Congress, that investigated the attacks. And at the time when this investigation was carried out, one member of the 9/11 Commission said, this is not a good investigation. It has no solid access to documents. And he resigned from the commission. He said, this is not good. It's not quality research. Who is that? It is Max Cleland. He's a Vietnam War veteran. He lost both legs and one arm in the Vietnam War. And he was later a senator for Georgia, and he was in that commission. And he said, I cannot look any American in the eye, especially family members of the victims, and say that the 9/11 Commission had full access. The 9/11 Commission is now compromised. So he stepped down. He said, we didn't get the documents. We didn't get Cheney and Bush to testify under oath in public. We didn't get that. Cleveland said the Bush administration stonewalled the commission in its request for documents and other evidence about 9/11. That is really bad. That's bad news, because we as historians need a good investigation. What we then had in 2004 is that the authors of that commission presented their report and confirmed the surprise theory. Okay? That's the official theory, and it's now being confirmed by the 9/11 Commission. And Bush thanked them very much. And really the question is whether you trust Thomas Keane and Lee Hamilton. It's again a question of whether you trust them. That's really the question. If as a historian you have to make up your mind, you have to always find out whom do you trust. Furthermore, they didn't write the report themselves. It was a professor. His name is Philip Zelikow. He wrote the book. It's a book of 560 pages, so it's a really thick book, and I read it with my students. They had to read it. And most people never read the 9/11 Commission report. But Philip Zelikow wrote the whole book, and he says surprise is the correct description of what happened on 9/11. Okay. But that's not the only story that you have in the United States. You have other people who completely disagree and say the 9/11 Commission report is worth nothing. Now, who are these people? There's a professor, David Ray Griffin. He's a retired professor, so he's no longer at university. You know, that's sometimes helpful, because obviously there's a lot of pressure. If you research 9/11 at university, you can lose your job, it's true. So retired US professor David Ray Griffin is a professor of philosophy of religion, okay? You know, that's not the first thing you think of if you think of somebody who'd researched 9/11. And he says 9/11 was not surprise, it was MIHOP, make it happen on purpose. So he argues that the American government orchestrated the attacks. He's not saying the American people. That's a huge difference. There's 300 million people living in America, and he's saying there's a corrupt elite, and they were involved in the attacks. He was dismissed in the beginning as somebody who's just crazy. But then he wrote 10 books. He started to write books about 9/11 in 2004. Then he added another one in 2005. Then in 2007. Then in 2008. Then in 9. In 9 he even wrote 2. And then in 2010 another one. And now the newest one is coming out in September 2011. It's quite impressive. So there's a whole series of books. And he's an outstanding scholar on 9/11. So if today you try to research 9/11, you have to read the 9/11 Commission report, obviously. That's the version of Bush. But also you have to read the books of David Ray Griffin. Not all, but maybe a selection. And he says, he believes that the US government orchestrated the attacks. The goal would be to get control of the world's oil and establish a new doctrine of preemptive warfare. That was a difficult sell before 9/11. So he really says, before 9/11, it would not have been possible to start preemptive wars. A preemptive war is a war that you engage in without having been attacked. You say, I bombed the other one because I think he's going to bomb me. Do you understand the difference? That's a huge difference. If you fight a war after having been attacked, then it's a defensive war. If you attack a country whom you have not, who has not attacked you, then it's either a war of aggression, and that's something very terrible since Hitler invaded Poland, in 1939. Historians are very, sensitive about wars of aggression. But now these wars are not called wars of aggression, the Iraq War, they are called preemptive wars. Because that means you do a war to stop a war which would be coming if you don't do your war. Griffin says there is no change. There is no change from Bush to Obama. There's no change. He says the White House has never, and to this very day, has never started a new investigation of the terrorist attacks of 9/11. There's no interest in the White House at all to have a new debate about 9/11. In the US Congress, so the Senate and the House of Representatives, there's no interest in such a debate either. But you do have former senators, former American senators, who say we must research 9/11 anew. One senator is Mike Gravel. He was a senator for Alaska from 69 to 81. And he's now saying we should have a movement in the states. So there's, the US is made up of different states, and one state, for instance, California, can decide we're going to have a new 9/11 investigation. And that would affect the whole discourse. He said, don't wait for White House, don't wait for Congress, go to the level of the states, and there we should have a new debate. He's saying the government's official account is inaccurate, incomplete, implausible, and in fact constitutes a flimsy conspiracy theory. So he's making the argument that the surprise theory is not convincing. He says there is an urgent need for a new independent investigation with subpoena powers and other grand jury powers. Subpoena basically means that you can say, we are investigating this, and everybody who was involved, who had an official function, has to come and testify under oath. That is really an important thing if you can do such an investigation. Now, what I've shown you in this chapter, I've had the 9/11 debate, is that there is a very big debate in the United States going on. There's no agreement on what happened. And I've seen that many people who ask questions about 9/11 are dismissed as people who believe in conspiracies. And that is then, put in a way that people suggest conspiracies are nonsense. That's what you see. And as historians, I'm obviously aware that sometimes you have conspiracies. For instance, when Fidel Castro and Nikita Khrushchev decided to put nuclear missiles into Cuba, they didn't tell Kennedy before, okay? That's the conspiracy, to agree silently. If two people agree in silence, that's the conspiracy. Or when the CIA overthrows Salvador Allende on September 11, but 1973, it was a conspiracy. They didn't call Salvador Allende first. Later you had Pinochet installed in Chile. So yes, there are conspiracies. Not everything is a conspiracy, but sometimes you have conspiracies. When the French Secret Service sank the Rainbow Warrior in 1985, they bombed the ship because Greenpeace was protesting against French atomic tests in the Pacific. So Greenpeace was also always going there with the ship, so the French couldn't have their atomic testing. They just sank the ship with a bomb. That's terrorism. But it's state terrorism. It's the Secret Service who carries it out, and this is the photographer who died on the boat. He wasn't informed of it, okay? So it's a conspiracy. Or the Iran-Contra affair in 1986. You had Oliver North, who was involved, and others, who sent money to the Contras, which they had earned from selling arms to Iran. And at the time, Congress had said the United States cannot sell arms to Iran. And then the White House ran away and secretly did it and used the money to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. That was a conspiracy. Or if you take the Watergate breaking, it's a very interesting conspiracy. Nixon, here to the left, and Haldeman, his chief of staff, Nixon, ordered this break-in in the Watergate complex, and then later, a week after the break-in, Haldeman told Nixon in the White House, "We now have the records." It always takes a long time until the historians have the records, but we have them. The democratic break-in thing, we're back to in the problem area because the FBI is not under control, Haldeman says, and then Nixon instructs to use the CIA to obstruct the FBI. So the White House sometimes uses the different services to obstruct each other, and they say, Nixon said, play it tough. That's the way they play it, and that's the way we're going to play. So that was a conspiracy. Nixon later had to resign.